What's the responsibility of living in the age of AI, fascism, and genocide? That was the question on the table at our first live In Bed with the Elephant event, held at a beloved downtown Ottawa restaurant as part of the Press Forward Future of Independent Media Summit in early October 2025. The session, recorded in front of an engaged audience of loyal listeners, featured a conversation with one of the bright lights of his generation, the razor-sharp and dynamic Newfoundland-born writer, journalist, and podcaster, Luke Savage. The evening was an attempt to come to grips with the challenges of living in a dystopian historical moment while seizing upon the possibilities in our midst to transform it and create a world anew. We hope you enjoy listening to it.
Hello, everyone! Andrea Houston here, managing editor of Ricochet Media. I'm also on the board of Press Forward, and we're really thrilled to bring this event to you tonight. So excited about it. At Ricochet Media, we have been around for more than a decade. We launched in 2014. A number of young, scrappy journalists wanted to start a publication that challenged the mainstream and covered stories that weren't being covered. And we continue to do that to this day. We cover mostly Indigenous news, climate, housing, democracy issues, human rights broadly. We've been so lucky to grow exponentially in the past few years, hiring on the incredible Brandy Morin and starting a couple of podcasts, one of which you're going to hear more about tonight and see a live taping. In Bed with the Elephant started with the rise of the Donald Trump far-right regime. We wanted to create a podcast that not only reflected the current moment that we're in right now, this very terrifying, crazy moment, but we also wanted to do it from the perspective of Canada and really bring on guests that challenged thinking and created opportunities for conversation that bridged a divide. And there's no better person to do this and to lead these conversations than the host, Adrian Harewood, who is with us tonight to lead tonight's conversation. And I'm so excited to introduce him and who's going to introduce our incredible special guest. And I'm going to do that right now. So over to Adrian Harewood. Give him a round of applause.
Well, first of all, Andrew, thanks so much. Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. It is a delight to be here at Union Local 613. A couple months ago, 9 months ago, it would have been impossible to fathom that we would be here. In April, we launched this podcast, and in the last, 6 months, we've done about 22 episodes. And this podcast could not have taken place had it not been for the support of folks like Andrea, the executive producer at Ricochet, also Ethan Cox. I want to recognize Sophia de Guzman here as also part of our team. Zara Kozuma, Connor Kaloran as well, the graphic designer. And I'm also going to mention my son, Parker Harewood, who is responsible for the music. He composed, my 14-year-old composed the music for this. Bravo. So we are really proud of what we've done so far. And we also just want to thank and acknowledge you, the audience. A lot of you have been very faithful in listening to the show and providing us with a tremendous amount of encouragement. So we really do appreciate that. I also just want to recognize this space, because for those of you who aren't from Ottawa, Union Local 613 is very important to Ottawans. And I want to recognize Ivan Getz, the owner of this place. Union has always been on the right side of history, right? This is an institution that supports ordinary working people each and every day. And I just want to acknowledge that and thank them for providing us with this space this evening. So thank you for that. So In Bed with the Elephant is a current affairs podcast that talks about national politics and also international politics and culture. Our objective tonight is to have a wide-ranging conversation. The topic for tonight is prospects for change in perilous times, on the responsibility of living in an age of AI, fascism, and genocide. And I can think of no better person to join us tonight than Luke Savage. Luke is a writer and essayist whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Statesman, The Washington Post, and The Guardian, also the Smithsonian Magazine, and the Literary Review of Canada. He was born in St. John's, Newfoundland. He studied political science and history at the U of T. He was the editor of the largest student newspaper in the country, The Varsity. Not as good as The Daily, but still. He has been a staff writer at Jacobin. Sorry, The Daily is at McGill, just for those of you. He's been a staff writer at Jacobin since 2018, where he's a frequent commentator on American, British, and Canadian politics. He is the co-host of the popular Michael and Us podcast, a twice-weekly show about politics, cinema, and our crumbling world. He's the author of Dead Center, Reflections, Liberalism, and Democracy After the End of History. He was also a contributor to a remarkable memoir by former federal NDP leader Ed Broadbent called Seeking Social Democracy, 7 Decades in the Fight for Equality. Please give a very warm welcome to Luke Savage. I wanted to begin by talking about someone who is very, very dear, I would say, to people in this riding. Ed Broadbent represented Ottawa Centre between 2004 and 2006. We know, of course, that Ed Broadbent was the leader of the federal NDP between 1975 and 1989. You were someone who knew Ed Broadbent very well. You were someone who was mentored by him, I would say. You were someone who became a friend of his. And you also contributed to this really remarkable memoir that I mentioned, Seeking Social Democracy. You were a contributor to this book. Maybe the question I wanted to ask you is, why do you think it's important for us in this moment to understand who Ed Broadbent was?
So I guess just to be personal for a second, Ed Broadbent was somebody who, in a sense, I knew his mind before I knew him personally. In the introduction to our book, I write about an experience I had as an undergraduate finding a little-known book of Ed's called The Liberal Ripoff, which was published in 1970 and out of print since 1970 as well. I found that at a secondhand bookstore in Toronto, and I thought it was a remarkable book. It had a really significant impact on my thinking and on my politics. There was something about the way that Ed Broadbent was able, having had this background as an academic, the way he was able to put kind of abstract ideas and really serious ideological commitment in conversation with political practice, and to be very successful at that. And I think that's something that very few people do well. I think it's something that a lot of academics are very bad at historically. I say as the son of two academics. I think it's one of the things that made Ed the remarkable figure that he was. I think, the Honest Ed tag, which was applied to him in the 1980s, I really think that the authenticity and honesty that people got from him, that he projected, had a lot to do with the fact that when he talked about really any issue, his understanding of it was, rooted in really deep and sometimes quite abstract reflection about that issue on the one hand, and the concerns of the people he was trying to represent on the other. And I think that's something we could use always, but especially today.
He called himself a social democrat. He called himself a democratic socialist. What did social democracy mean to him?
Wow. How much time you got?
Well, what kind of social democrat was he?
It's a really interesting question. In some ways, I think he was a quite radical social democrat, and I should say he always used socialist and social democrat as completely interchangeable terms, which is somewhat unusual. But I found interviews with him and things that he wrote from before he was in politics in the mid 1960s, and he's still he's using them interchangeably then. So Ed Broadbent was nothing if not consistent. But yeah, in some ways, I'm not really sure how to answer your question because it's such a big one.
Well, okay. So what was important to him? What did he want to do with his politics?
Sure. I mean, I think in the 1960s when Ed Broadbent made the leap from academia to politics, which was something that he'd been asked to do in 1965, and he declined. He wanted to, keep his teaching job at York. By 1968, he didn't really feel that way anymore. He was actually quite distressed at the popularity of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who he thought of as a very conservative figure. He said to me, and this is 55, 60 years later, something like that, that when he got into politics, in some ways, he saw it as he wanted to offer an alternative to Trudeauism and to liberalism. And so for him, that meant preserving the things that were good about liberalism, the things that were egalitarian, celebration and emphasis on individual rights, personal freedoms, that kind of thing. But, Ed was also a socialist, so he didn't think that those kinds of things could be fully realized in a society in which wealth was so unevenly distributed, in which so much of our lives plays out against the backdrop of the market, and the kind of transactional relationships that come with that. For Ed, socialism really was, and not everyone who's been a socialist has seen it in these terms, but for Ed, being a socialist was in a really important way about supporting individual freedom and creating the kind of society where every person would be able to fully realize their potential, whatever that might be.
And he was a socialist who was very critical of the time at the Soviet model. And he's someone who would have been very much informed by what had happened in 12 years earlier, 1956, the Hungarian Revolution, which is basically crushed by the Soviet faction within Hungary. What was it about the Soviet Union that he found so distasteful? As a socialist,
he could see that it wasn't working, and that the kind of dogma around collective ownership, nationalization that had, and what was then called the command economy, it hadn't delivered what Lenin, and others had said that it would. So that was part of it. He also
there's a lack of humanism.
There's a lack of humanism. There's a lack of attention to individual freedom, and obviously, in the 1950s, which is still the era of Joseph Stalin, civil liberties are not very good inside the Soviet Union. So that's a big part of it. Something else, there was a book that came out, I think, around the time of the Hungarian uprising called The God That Failed. This was a really influential book on Ed. He read it as an undergraduate. He brought it up with me constantly. This had contributions, essays by people like Arthur Koestler, who's best known for his novel Darkness at Noon, Ignacio Stone, I believe Albert Camus was in there. And so, these were all people who were ex-communists, but who moved to democratic socialism rather than, as some ex-communists did, to the authoritarian right.
One of the reasons why I think it's important for us to kind of remember and to talk about Broadbent is because he had a sense of possibility. He had a sense that things could change. He had a sense that another world was possible. And he writes, in his book, he writes, there was never any sense. So he was a lower working class kid, right?
Yeah.
Grew up in Oshawa. He was the first person in his family to go to university. And he writes, there was never any sense of deprivation or the feeling that this was some great struggle. I took it as being very natural and very possible for someone like me from an ordinary family where no one had a post-secondary education to make an effort and get into the University of Toronto. Can you talk about his sense of possibility, that kind of hope that seemed to be, at his core?
I think this was one of the things that, before I knew him and when I knew him, made Ed and the way he saw the world very appealing to me, very inspiring. Because, he grew up in a time where there really was tremendous optimism because people had experienced, especially people, like his family, working class families like his family in Oshawa. Ed was born in 1936 when trade unions were basically still illegal. They didn't have proper legal recognition. And the year he was born, just a few months after he was born, there was the massive Oshawa sit-down strike, which was one of the real catalysts for industrial unionism in North America and for the legal recognition of unions. And his uncle was in GM. Yeah, that's right. His uncle Aubrey was on the picket lines. In fact, he said, I think this is in the book, members of his family put in something like cumulatively over 200 years of work at General Motors. And so if they hadn't had UAW Local 222 in Oshawa, if they had not had the kind of collective prosperity and shared abundance that Ed was lucky enough, fortunate enough to grow up in, growing up after the Second World War, those 200 years of cumulative work at GM, on the assembly lines mostly, would have been very, very different. Coming into the 1960s, Ed is somebody who's grown up in this world that's very different from the one that his parents grew up in. And I think that really informed the spirit of quite radical optimism that he brought into politics when he made the jump in 1968. And I always found it particularly inspiring, having grown up in the 1990s, which I think by comparison to the 1960s is a time of paralysis in many ways. Politically a much less interesting time. And I think it's a much less optimistic time as well.
Yeah, he won by 15 votes that year.
Yeah, there's the old cliche that every vote counts. Don't let them tell you that's not true. At Broadbent's first election, the former Tory Labour Minister, Michael Starr, Tory heavyweight in Oshawa, who Ed was photographed with at age, I think, 15 on a trip to Parliament Hill, Ed beat him by 15 votes. So every vote really does count.
Broadbent said that the two most important characteristics of social democracy to me are a commitment to equality and a commitment to decommodification. So can you talk first about equality, why that was important to him, and then decommodification?
Well, I'm currently trying to put together, or I should say I am putting together, Ed's collected works. And I believe, still shuffling some things around, but the very first thing on the table of contents right now is from 1962. Ed wrote it in grad school, and it's quite literally called Equality as a Socialist Goal. So equality in the full sense, a material sense, an equality of not just formal, we're all formally legally equal. We all have civil and political rights. We can all vote in elections, that kind of thing. But a more substantive equality rooted in shared goods, public goods, which by decommodification, which as I realize is kind of a $10 word, what Ed meant was simply taking things out of the marketplace. So that's not alien to us as Canadians in many ways, because that's how health insurance works.
He was basically saying that he wanted to make people's lives easier so that they could realize their full human potential, so that they would have the time to do the things that they wanted to do as human beings, so that they could become more human beings.
That's right, because if we have comprehensive public education, post-secondary education, cradle-to-grave social security, if we have low interest, public housing, which was something that Ed pursued. He wanted to decommodify a substantial portion of the housing sector when he was NDP housing critic in the 1970s. It's a less well-known part of his career. If we have all those things right, then people are free. They're liberated in a sense to, from the grind of life, from the grind of having to compete in the marketplace. They're freer as well as workers and as employees, because they don't necessarily need to take jobs that don't pay well and that are alienating.
Was he anti-competition? Like, did he believe in no competition in a society?
No, certainly not. I think he thought there was a role for it. I think he was more interested, though, in, first of all, he was very fond of pointing out that the way a lot of our economy works, it might formally be called market competition, but, he was saying this in the 70s, and it's even truer today, right? When we're talking about how big multinationals operate, this isn't competition. Look at our telecommunications sector here in Canada. Do you want to tell me that Rogers and Bell are competing and that we have the benefits of market competition? Absolutely not. So that's one thing. But I think he was also interested in how the economy was owned and how, businesses were owned. And one of the things he spent a lot of time on early in his political career was this idea of industrial democracy. And in its kind of most radical form, he really was suggesting unions should be able to bargain not just for better wages, better working conditions, but for management rights. So, it's a very kind of emblematically Ed Broadbent idea, because if that had happened, capitalism probably would have been abolished eventually, but in a very polite and gradualist kind of way, which is very typical of Ed.
But his argument was that there was too much power, that the corporate sector in this country had too much power, and that ordinary people should be able to participate in the decision-making of the society. Is that...
That's absolutely right, because as political citizens in liberal democracies, we can vote for our representatives, that kind of thing. participation, right, in the sphere of life where most of us spend kind of the majority of our waking hours, the workplace, is much, much lower. A lot of the decisions that affect our lives are made in corporate boardrooms, many of them not even in this country, right? Many of them in the country to the south, which will probably come up later, I imagine. Democracy in the fullest sense for Ed meant something beyond the kind of political democracy that we know. It meant economic democracy as well.
Did he recognize any limitations in social democracy? Did he recognize any contradictions within social democracy?
I mean, he never believed it was possible to create a perfect society of any kind.
So there would always be inequality?
There would always be some inequalities of outcome because there are, people have different priorities in life. Talents and interests and these kinds of things are not distributed evenly necessarily. And even in a much more egalitarian societies, they would probably remain. Nonetheless, I think that if we had the kind of equality that he was envisioning, society would look unrecognizable from the one we know today.
What role did he want for unions, and particularly with regard to the way in which the NDP as a party operated? What role did he see for unions?
Ed Broadbent saw the trade union relationship as absolutely essential to the identity of the NDP. Ed was very influenced by colleagues he came to know in Europe through the Socialist International, people like Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, Socialist Prime Minister of Sweden.
Who was, of course, assassinated in
who was
85,
assassinated
86,
in the 1980s, yeah. Willy Brandt, who was the former West German Chancellor as well, a close friend of Ed's. And when Ed looked at how these parties worked in Europe, who, unlike the NDP, had formed national governments in many cases, they all had very close relationships with trade unions. So he used to say, a socialist or social democratic party without trade unions is a bit like, Christianity without Christ. It's a contradiction in terms.
The NDP, in its current iteration, is at a crossroads. It had a disastrous election. In the federal election of 2025, it was reduced to some 7 seats. It is in a difficult place right now. We know that the NDP currently is having a leadership contest. We know that Heather McPherson, the Alberta MP, is one of the candidates. Also, Avi Lewis, former broadcaster, is also a candidate. What are some things that you think this current edition of the NDP could learn from the example of Ed Broadbent?
I think that Ed was somebody who was really not afraid of ideology and was happy to wear it on his sleeve. And, I think that that's something that politics in general these days, we don't have enough ideology, in my opinion. I think we have a politics that can be very polarized, can be kind of very, divided, particularly around a lot of contentious cultural issues and so on. But, I think political language and political rhetoric from, mainstream politicians across the political spectrum has become much flatter than it used to be.
Can you kind of elaborate on that? So when you say there's not enough ideology, you're saying that there's not enough ideas, there's not enough kind of engagement about political principle? Like what exactly do you mean?
I think one thing breeds the other. I think when there isn't a kind of robust culture of ideas, this is a particular problem if you're a left wing or a social democratic party. That breeds a kind of, it fosters a kind of political rhetoric that can be kind of flat and that, may sound broad and inclusive because it kind of gestures at things that don't sound disagreeable, but it doesn't. If political language is entirely shorn of sharp edges, I think it can end up not really meaning a whole lot, and it can kind of switch people off, right? There's a homogenization that goes on because all political language starts to converge. And I don't think that's helpful. So that's not something that, that's not an innovation of Ed Broadbent's in particular. He happened to be in politics at a time when politics, I think, were in a kind of non-pejorative sense, more ideological for the better. But yeah, that's something that certainly, that I think of when I think back to his time in politics and the way he spoke.
Luke Savage, you've said that you're concerned that our present political order lacks the dynamism and progressive ambition once promised to us by the democratic age. So what would an age of ambition look like? What would it consist of?
That passage, by the way, if I'm not misremembering the source of my own prose, but that's from the introduction to Seeking Social Democracy. There I'm comparing, I suppose, implicitly the world I grew up in from the one that Ed grew up in, which, as you said, Adrian, was this kind of world of tremendous possibility.
You were born in 1989.
1989. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on the cusp of the end of history, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama.
Yeah.
And you came of age really in what, 2008? Like that was a pretty important moment to you. What do you remember from that election, that famous election that happened in 2008? We're talking, of course, about Barack Obama. Where were you?
I was at University College that I just moved to Toronto a few months earlier. I was in my dorm, Sir Daniel Wilson residence, Hutton House in particular. And what I remember from that night was people streaming out into the quad in tears. This is a Canadian campus, right? There's a few Americans there, but the moment seemed so significant, I think, to many of us at the time that it didn't even matter that this was happening in another country. It felt like a generation-defining event. And in retrospect, that was true, but just not in the way that I thought at the time.
You were moved by what was going on.
Absolutely. I think...
Why? Why were you moved? What was so moving about the fact that Barack Obama wins the election in the United States?
Well, I think the election of America's first black president was a very moving thing to see at the time, and because it felt like it didn't seem possible, so it felt like this kind of vindication of possibility. Also because I'd sort of come of age in the Bush era, and Obama seemed to be a negation of everything, that I'd hated about the Bush era. So the stars all kind of seemed perfectly lined up for a really significant kind of political transformation that I imagined was going to spread, across the world. And instead, I think Obama was a very conservative figure. I don't think he was actually very interested in changing things in any profound way. There's a lot of talk about, we're building a mass movement. As soon as he won the election, the mass movement became, we're packing this up. You can go home, everyone. We're going to go back to the Beltway. We're going to bring back half of, Bill Clinton's cabinet. We're going to bail out all the banks, and we're going to let homeowners sink. And there's a direct line from that to Donald Trump. There absolutely is. So
you don't think he was interested in making change? You think he was all about maintaining the status quo?
He's told us as much in the recent memoir he did. He's done 3 or 4 memoirs, I think, but A Promised Land, which I reviewed for Current Affairs a few years ago. He's talking, I think, specifically about the Obama administration's response to the financial crisis. And he says that bailing out homeowners or prosecuting bankers would have, and these are his words, he said it would have done violence to the social order. So, if that's how you see the world, that is, I think, essentially a small c conservative view of the world. And he certainly did not act like somebody who was trying to significantly transform things. I think there's a story that's often told, particularly by people who worked in that administration, that they came in with all these ambitions and then they faced all this obstruction. They certainly did face obstruction, but I don't think that that's the real reason that moment frustrated the hopes for it that so many of us had had.
For a particular generation in this country, there were a lot of people who were hopeful when Justin Trudeau won the election in 2015.
Not me, for the record.
Yeah, but
I was a little older then, a little wiser.
But there were folks who invested a lot in him.
Sure.
And who felt as if he was a change agent. What do you say to those people who become disengaged or who feel as if, and become demoralized because they feel duped?
Yeah.
They feel as if they've been sold a bill of goods, and that these figures, whether it's Obama, whether it's Trudeau, are just these kind of, lightweight liberals.
Yeah. This to me, it's a really important question. And one of the reasons why I spend so much time writing critically about liberals and about the liberal mainstream is because I think that, the kind of moments we've been talking about, whether it's Obama 2008, whether it's kind of a bit of an ersatz Obama moment like Trudeau 2015, I think that the frustrations people feel when they think they're voting for change, they think they're voting for progress, they think they're basically voting for a social democratic platform of some kind, and then, they get, another round of neoliberalism instead. A lot of people do switch off, right? A lot of people become very cynical about politics. Those disappointments make people more vulnerable, more susceptible to the far right. I think the far right and a lot of what it's selling becomes more intoxicating if you are alienated from the political mainstream. And I think Liberals are not themselves solely responsible for that, but I do think they played a really, really significant role when they've wielded power in creating those kinds of conditions.
What would Ed Broadbent have to say about the reason why Social Democrats have never won power federally in this country? What's the reason for that?
Well, he was asked that in, I think, his last ever radio interview on the CBC, and I think he responded, "Well, if I knew that, I probably would have become prime minister."
Well, let me ask you. Like, why haven't? Because Social Democrats have done well. They're doing well in BC right now, provincially. Bob Canoe, the NDP premier of Manitoba, is the most popular politician in the country. Rachel Notley for a while, she wins power in Alberta. The NDP has had success on the provincial. Of course, famously, Dave Barrett back in the 1970s wins power.
Yes.
Right? The NDP victory that Bob Rae, who became a Liberal later, win in 1995. Right? So there have been significant victories on the provincial level. Why hasn't the NDP been able to be successable at the federal level?
Again, this is, we could spend the whole night talking about this, but my simple answer to that question would be Quebec. To go back to Ed Broadbent for a second, he was very inspired, as I said, and was kind of modeling a lot of what he was doing on successful socialist parties in Europe. Those parties are not operating in contexts where federalism is such a live issue, right? Where politics is so highly regionalized. Here in Canada, between the 1960s, when the Quiet Revolution happens in Quebec, right up to 1995, you have 2 referendums on separation. You have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the failure of the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord. So Canadian politics are kind of consumed with things that, much more so than in other countries during the same period, kind of help to marginalize the politics of redistribution and class. And you add to that, just more concretely, the fact that in Quebec, the trade union movement, right, which would have been the basis in many ways of the NDP's support, it splits, right? Some trade union leaders go to Ottawa with Pierre Trudeau.
Jean Marchand.
Yeah, Marchand and Pelletier go to Ottawa with Pierre Trudeau because for them the issue is we want to keep Quebec in the Federation. Others become sovereigntists. They become involved in the PQ. Sadly didn't make much difference for Ed, on election night in '88, but he did get an endorsement from the Quebec Federation of Labour, which held that was the largest rally for any party in the campaign, was the Quebec Federation of Labour rally for Ed and the NDP in I believe Montreal. So I know that was a very important endorsement for him to get. It was meant a lot to him because, as he saw it, there was no way the NDP was going to form a national government without Quebec. And if, you were going to win Quebec as the NDP, you needed workers and you needed trade unionists.
We see that there are kind of 2 different arms, shall we say, of the NDP represented by the leadership candidates right now. Heather McPherson from Alberta, I guess I would almost call her a kind of a Rachel Notley, maybe NDPer, New Democrat. Avi Lewis, maybe more of a Mel Watkins, Jim Laxer, Waffle, New Democrat from the 1970s, a little bit more radical, shall we say? There are some who will argue that Rachel Notley actually won power, that David Eby won power in British Columbia, that the way to go for the NDP is to be more pragmatic and to not to kind of embrace this kind of radical manifesto, like the Leap manifesto that Avi Lewis is one of the authors of. What's the way to go for the NDP at this moment?
Well, I guess my flippant answer to that would be sometimes radicalism is pragmatic. That would be the first thing. Secondly, though, I guess if I was putting on my political science hat, I would say that when the NDP wins in the West, right, the model is not always kind of transferable to the national level. For the very simple reason that west of Ontario, you basically have 2-party systems, right? The NDP is the Liberal Party doesn't really exist west of Ontario in the same way, right? It's still very powerful nationally, very powerful in Quebec, although of course its provincial wings aren't officially affiliated with the federal Liberal Party, but so in Manitoba, in BC, in Saskatchewan, and in Alberta, the NDP is able to be the kind of de facto center-left option, which is just not what that's not the hand the federal NDP is working with. So I don't think that the kinds of strategies kind of electoral strategies used in those provinces are really transferable always to the national context.
I want to switch gears a bit right now because we are living in, I would argue, a very dystopian moment. In the last 2 years, in Gaza, some 60,000 people have been killed. 60,000 Palestinians have been killed by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Of those 60,000, 20,000 children have been slaughtered.
Yeah, and I suspect, sorry to interrupt you, I suspect the numbers are much higher. Of course, those are the official numbers, but I suspect we'll find out that they're much higher than that.
Yeah, most of the world's human rights organizations are saying that what's going on there is genocide. Every single day, we see another couple dozen Palestinians killed, many of them trying to get food. We see the rise of the far right across the world. We see, for example, the fact that the far right, led by Marine Le Pen, could very well win the next election in France. We know that the AfD in Germany has become one of the most powerful parties. It's basically a neo-Nazi party in Germany. They're getting closer and closer to power. We see Viktor Orban in Hungary. We see
Nigel Farage in
Nigel
Britain
Farage,
as well, yeah.
and we see, for example, Tommy Robinson. You know, the fact that he was able to bring 100,000 people, I think, to the streets.
Yeah, terrifying number. The biggest far right demonstration in the UK since the 1970s.
So a lot of people looking at the scene are saying, you know, what's to be done? Like we probably should just give up at this stage, right? How do you respond to that? How do you respond to particularly young people who are saying, I just want to get out of here?
Oh, sorry, go where?
Well, okay, but you understand, they just want to detach themselves from. So what do you say to people who've lost hope at this stage?
Yeah, I guess this is maybe lazy on my part, but to just reach for another cliche. The cliche that you might not be interested in politics, but politics are interested in you, applies here. I don't know. You can retreat to digital silos. You can follow whatever vloggers you like or food vlogs or whatever, and I encourage you, do that. Don't just watch the news all the time. The news is scary. It sucks. Yeah, there's no again, it's a flippant answer, but yeah, go where?
Well,
we can't afford to give up hope, right?
So the question I wanted to ask tonight was, what's the responsibility of living in an age of genocide, living in an age of fascism, living in an age of AI? What do you see as being the responsibility of living in this moment?
I've found this last year, I've found myself, for want of a better way of putting it, writing a lot about, why is everything so shitty? Yeah, everything's so shitty, but also why? And in some ways, that might make it sound like I'm feeling very pessimistic about things. That's not the case at all. I think because everything feels so shitty, because everything feels so bad, because the news is so kind of consistently disturbing, because the media environment, the things all the apps we're scrolling on are even more disorienting and distracting than, they were even 5 years earlier. All of us, I think, we have this ambient sense that of kind of maybe decline or this, paralysis, things aren't working properly. I think that can lead to a sort of mystification of things. And the mystification to me is what, that is the real source of kind of lack of hope and optimism. I think by explaining and accounting for, no, a lot of these problems have identifiable roots in our political and economic consensus, in how our institutions are operating or how they're functioning or not functioning. So on the question of responsibility, I guess I see it as, I can only answer for myself here. My responsibility, I suppose, is just to write the truth about our world as I see it and about our society as I see it. And I think often what that means is challenging the mainstream narratives that a lot of our institutions are still kind of locked inside, even if maybe it seems like people are just going through the motions and don't really believe in these things. Paralysis, people feel paralysis when they can, look outside and see that the official story that they're being told about their society is visibly and demonstrably not true. But, they need access to, there needs to be an alternative. So I guess, in my own kind of, in my own minor contribution that I try to make. It's to identify the problems and their sources, and to sketch out that alternative as best I can.
You know, I often think that we don't talk enough about history, and that we need to be invoking history more often. Like, I think back to the fact that in 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, is brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi, right? We know that a couple months later, the Montgomery bus boycott, right, emerges. And through the Montgomery bus boycott, the world is introduced to this gentleman, Martin Luther King Jr., right? A couple years later, we see that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kind of emerges in 1960, right? And the folks who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were themselves kids when Emmett Till had been killed. Like, they were inspired to organize because of Emmett Till. I think about, for example, my own history. I think back to the fact that in 1989, when I graduated from high school, in the summer of 1989, I went behind the Iron Curtain. I was in Czechoslovakia that summer, 1989, a couple months before the Velvet Revolution, before everything changed. When I went to Czechoslovakia that summer, I could tell that there was something up. There was so much fear. There was so much kind of secrecy. It felt as if everyone was whispering. And there's no way that anyone, I think at that moment in July 1989, anyone would have imagined that the wall would fall in a couple months, right? That everything kind of changed. In that year also, you know, when I was my first year at university, in September of 1989, Nelson Mandela was still in jail. And the next year, 1990, he's out. We couldn't have imagined. We would never have imagined that Mandela was going to be out of prison. So I think that it's important for us to recognize that anything can happen, right? That history is always in the making. We can always make new history.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think really since 2020, I feel like, really, I suppose, since the collapse of the second Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, so I guess I can date it pretty specifically, March of 2020, I feel like I've increasingly turned to history. I feel like I've realized it always has more to say about the present than you might otherwise think. And yeah, as you said, for the exact reason you just said, there's a lot of inspiration that can be drawn from it, because, as you say, things really can change very, very quickly. And I think we've even seen that, in the past year for the better. I mean,
Mark Carney.
Uh-huh.
Who would have predicted Mark Carney last year?
Uh-huh.
Like when Poilievre and the Conservatives were 25% ahead, 25 points ahead, people would not have predicted that the Liberals would manage to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat.
Sure. So, I mean, the flip side of our, of politics and culture and society being so kind of disorienting and unpredictable is that sometimes the unpredictability, I mean, I was going to reach for a more hopeful example than that one, but, that's a good sort of, well, I was going to say neutral example. We'll get into that, I'm sure. But, think about, I doubt that too many people in this room had heard of Zoran Mamdani, right? Like a year ago. And, if you'd have told me a year ago that New York City, the center of global finance in many ways, right? One of the most important cities in the world, also one of the site of one of the most kind of ossified and right-wing Democratic Party machines in the entire United States, that like a young socialist was going to defeat Andrew Cuomo and almost certainly get elected mayor of New York City. I mean, that's staggering, right? And if that can happen, who knows what else can happen.
You've been thinking a lot these past few months about Mark Carney. You've been writing a lot about Mark Carney. Who is he? What does he represent to you?
Well, recently I actually read his book and I reviewed it for the Baffler magazine. Yeah, Values. And I think Mark Carney is somebody who just believes very, very deeply. I think he has a lot of conviction about our current, political and economic order. I think he's basically comfortable with it. I think he thinks there's not any real alternatives to it. He's very skeptical of even kind of like quite mild attempts to reform it. I think what he's recognized, and I think you see this going all the way back to kind of 2010 when he was still a central banker, one of his political skills is that I think he's always understood that, lots of people, fewer and fewer people really feel, included in our political order, in our economic order. They don't feel like these things are working. And I think he's been pretty good at kind of attaching a story of sort of, compassionate capitalism, that kind of thing, onto what is, in my view, a pretty status quo kind of political project. I think Carney is somebody who thinks political problems are kind of technical, and that the thing that's been holding us back is that we don't have the requisite level of, elite management expertise that only somebody like him can bring. He has a command of the history of economics that probably few of our prime ministers have had. But yeah, you kind of get to the end after he's bombarded you with all this detail, and then, in the acknowledgments, it's like, I would like to thank, my friend Michael Bloomberg, who I draw tremendous inspiration from, and, then just rattles off a whole bunch of other people from like the Davos sect, and, it's a clue that we're dealing with something pretty conventional here.
No, but your friend, Ed Broadbent was influenced by a conservative too, Michael Oakeshott, as well, was he not?
Yeah, that's pretty nerdy stuff. No one in the room has heard of Michael Oakeshott, Adrian, but we can go there if you want.
Conservative political theorist.
Yeah, he was a British political theorist who Ed Broadbent studied with at the LSE in the early 1960s. Oakeshott had this famous metaphor that your job as a politician is to guide the ship of state, but not steer it to any particular harbor. Just keep it steady. Oakeshott was very skeptical of ideology of all kinds, and he was kind of looking for a way to evade it. Obviously, Ed could not accept that part of the experiment or that part of the theory, but he was attracted to the idea that, you do kind of have to meet people where they're at, like by definition. You can't, ideology can't be the only guide in politics. And I actually have a passage here on that that I'd like to read. It's one of my favorite passages of Ed's. He writes partway through our book, to champion a socialist vision in a capitalist world is, in a sense, a strangely paradoxical act of faith. Unless you're prepared to lose majorities, you will compromise your core beliefs. But to act on the basis of belief or program alone, without regard for the feelings and commitments of the majority in society, does both a profound disservice. In the real world of democracy, people have short-run problems they need solved, and most have little interest in grand political projects or ideological abstractions. Above all, what they want is results. The task, as I saw it, was thus to communicate a social democratic vision to ordinary Canadians as plainly and directly as I could, in a way that would be attractive and relevant to their daily lives. So that's how he saw things. And
Mark Carney would say that's what he's about. He's about producing results.
He would say to champion a socialist vision in a capitalist world.
He's about producing results.
Well, you raise a good point, because Ed believed what I just read very deeply, but of course, he begins that by putting a label on his beliefs, right? Democratic socialism. This worked the other way too, so it's worked in the other direction. So it's very easy, it's kind of tempting to see Ed Broadbent as a guy who's he's this academic, and then he enters the real world of politics, and gradually he's kind of disabused of his illusions or whatever. That's not what happened. There was always an ideological core of principle that he was absolutely unwavering from, and he also thought that ideology needed to temper the more broad and kind of less ideological language that politicians use as well. So in the 1980s, for example, the NDP was running on an industrial strategy, and a lot of Ed's advisors said, this is crazy, no one understands this, they don't know what this means. And he was pretty adamant that, well, yeah, maybe they don't know what it means, we'll try to explain it to them, but we are not doing our job as a social democratic party if we do not offer people an alternative vision for the economy. So Ed was certainly, partly because he learned from Michael Oakeshott, he was certainly kind of tempered in his approach to politics, and his ideas were disciplined by that. But ideology kind of disciplined things in the other direction as well.
Mark Carney presented himself as being someone who was a defender of the Canadian nation. Famously, that term "elbows up."
Yeah.
Someone who was also, I would argue, a defender of the Canadian nation, a defender of Canadian sovereignty, is someone, again, that you've been writing a lot about, and that's George Grant.
Yeah,
whose kind of famous tract, Lament for a Nation, was written 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think George Grant would have to say about a figure like Mark Carney?
I mean, I think in some ways George Grant kind of predicted Carneyism in that book. This is a book that I've been trying to get people into it for years. It must be said without very much success, but this was once, the biggest book in the country in the 1960s. It kind of came out of nowhere. George Grant was a basically unknown professor of religion at McMaster University. And he writes this book for the Little House of Anansi Press. Shout out, they're still going. Great Canadian publisher. The book is a very strange beast because it's called Lament for a Nation. Adrian's got it here, and if you can all see the front of it, it's Canadian flags looking pretty sad, right? And there is nothing in this book that says it's possible to save Canada, okay? Grant thought that, Canada's over. He was writing about the fall of the Diefenbaker government, which he was, very invested in at the time. Yeah, he thought, Canada's destined to be swallowed by the United States.
A branch plant economy.
A branch plant economy, and eventually thought the entire world, Canada was just going to be the first domino to fall. His next book, Technology and Empire, he said the world is moving inexorably towards what he called the universal homogenous state, right? So it's pretty pessimistic and dystopian stuff. But that is not how this book was received. Grant was a conservative, albeit in a kind of a different sense than that term means today.
More of a Tory.
More of a kind of a classical Tory. And the book was mostly influential on the left. It was very influential among students, student radicals. And I think that's what makes it, such an interesting book.
Yeah. And what do you think he would say about Mark Carney as being a defender of the nation?
Oh, I don't think he would think Mark Carney was a defender of the nation at all. I think in many ways Carney fits perfectly into kind of archetype that he's very critical of, who are small L liberal, bureaucrats and owners of big Canadian businesses, corporate enterprises, and so on, who aren't really too invested in the survival of Canada, kind of almost see it as sort of an appendage to the United States anyway, kind of see the Canadian economy and Canadian foreign policy in those terms. And so Grant would have been very critical of Carney, and I think he would have identified very quickly the giant lurch that we saw between the rhetoric of the campaign and the budget that the government now seems set to introduce, because Mark Carney is, I think, kind of he's the most right-wing prime minister we've had for since Stephen Harper, but in some ways, the budget may actually introduce larger cuts than even Harper attempted. And of course, Carney was invited to join Harper's cabinet at one point, but that's another story. But that's not the story that Carney told all of us during the election, right? There were two phrases that he used again and again, right? One of which, by the way, I'm pretty sure he stole from Ed Broadbent. He kept talking about how we need to become masters in our own house, which is
Jean Lesage.
Right.
That's Quiet Revolution.
So that's the Quiet Revolution.
Right, yeah. Maître chez nous.
So that's from the Quiet Revolution. The other one, which he stole from Ed, just getting my wires crossed there a bit, was we need to take control of our economic destiny, which is what Ed said when he launched the 1980 NDP campaign, and he was actually talking about partly the industrial strategy that I just mentioned. So whether people kind of were immediately aware, directly aware of what was being, what those historical reference points were, I don't think anybody heard, massive austerity. I think people heard nation building, we're going to build housing, just like we did after the Second World War. People didn't hear cuts in that. When Mark Carney invoked the Quiet Revolution, that slogan specifically, Maître chez nous, when the PQ was campaigning on that, or rather it was the Quebec Liberal Party at the time, but I think René Lévesque came up with it though, their big plank in that election, their big platform plank, was nationalization of hydroelectricity. So again, somewhat removed from the budget that we're about to see. So I think all of that was as a very cynical way to campaign, and that's what I have to say on that.
Luke Savage, thanks so much.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time.